Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. It's exactly 7 p.m. here in Kitchener, Ontario, so it's a real pleasure to have you here on this webinar, during which we're going to talk on canine reproduction and on the role of nutrition during a very specific life stage, gestation. So I must admit this is a topic which is very dear to my heart because I think today in veterinary medicine, we are always looking for ways to differentiate each other. And this is a topic that definitely is not so, we don't deal so much with it in our veterinary clinics, but however, from time to time, we might get questions on it. And it's very important to give very clear answers to our customers because this, in my experience, is something we often overlook. And the role of nutrition during gestation is definitely crucial. When I say it's something we overlook, this is something I personally overlooked when I was working here. So the picture you see here is the entrance of the veterinary school of Alfort in Paris, France. So that explains my French accent. So I'm a diplomate of the European College of Animal Reproduction. So while I was doing my residency, obviously I was from 2004 to 2011. Obviously, I was dealing a lot with clinical cases on canine and feline reproduction. So we were doing surgeries of the genital tract. We were dealing with clinical cases on pathology of reproduction. We were dealing with infertility. We were doing artificial inseminations, etc. But you know, during those 7 years, I must admit that I hardly discussed nutrition, the role of nutrition during gestation with my clients. I think it's maybe because I was essentially dealing with breeders, and I always assumed that breeders, they knew about the way they should properly feed a pregnant bitch or a pregnant queen. And the funny thing is that in 2011, my life took an unexpected turn, so I moved to Canada to work for Royal Canin Canada. So obviously I had to get used to the cold weather of your country, but after 4 years, I think I'm good now with the winter. I started obviously to speak more about nutrition during gestation with breeders. I met many of them. I asked them, oh, do they feed their bees during pregnancy, or do they feed their queens during pregnancy? And it's interesting because I realized that in fact, what I thought, the assumption I had at the beginning that all of them should know how to properly feed those animals was false. In fact, there are still many misconceptions out there, many myths that you can find when you just Google nutrition and gestation online. So I think today, as I said at the beginning, in the vet clinic, we are trying to differentiate each other. And reproduction is a very interesting area for that, because we receive few education usually at the vet school. I mean, when I was a vet student, I only received 2 hours of canine reproduction during my entire curriculum. I hope that it's different from in other vet schools, but I mainly learned about it when I left the veterinary school. And again, clients today are asking questions on this topic from time to time, and it's very important to provide them with very accurate answers, because nutrition definitely makes a difference when it comes to gestation. The way you feed a bitch and a queen during pregnancy will definitely have an impact on the animal and also on the puppies and kittens to be born. So tonight, what I want to do, I'm not going to give you a formal talk on what you should know about nutrition and gestation, but we are going to cover 3 clinical cases I received in my previous life in France and since I'm here in Canada, where nutrition directly impacts the outcome of the gestation. And if you have any questions during the talk, feel free to put your questions on the chat. We will try to answer them at the very end of the presentation. Again, feel free to ask as many questions as you like. I like that. So again, the goal is to be really to show you how we can use nutrition in real life to make a difference for those pets, and what are the advices you can give to your clients so that they can better use nutrition during gestation in the bitch, and we will touch a little bit in the queen as well. So we're going to start with a first case, and one thing I wanted to mention to you guys as well, I'm part of the veterinary consult line at Royal Canin Canada. So the picture here, somebody told me this afternoon I shouldn't show my desk, but I show it to you. This is my home office, and I'm showing this to you because part of my responsibilities is to help you guys, to support you when you want a second opinion on clinical cases on canine and feline reproduction, as well as kennel and cattery management. And that's why I've been in Canada for 4 years now, and I often receive clinical consultations from veterinarians all across the country on this topic. And a couple of years ago, a veterinarian called to discuss about this bitch, Stella. So Stella, she was a 3-year-old mixed breed bitch, and her owners, in fact, lived in the countryside. She was in season, she wasn't spayed, and she escaped for a couple of hours. So they didn't know where she went. And when finally they found her, they were wondering because there were entire males around. So they were wondering, had she been mated? Was she going to be pregnant? So they went to see their veterinarian to ask him the question, is there a risk? Is she going to be pregnant? And the veterinarian told them, if she has been bred, she was just bred, so it's very hard to tell right now. But come back in a few weeks and we will do an ultrasound and we will see if she's pregnant or not. So, and I totally agree with that. I think the best way to diagnose pregnancy in the beach when you want an early pregnancy diagnosis is definitely to do an ultrasound 3-4 weeks after the day of ovulation. So that's what they did in Stella. And in fact, 4 weeks after, she came back to the clinic. They did this ultrasound. And you can see here in the middle of the ultrasound picture, which is circled now in red, this is an embryo, a canine embryo. So no doubt, she was pregnant. So at this point, you can wonder, okay, but what's the big deal? She's pregnant? Well, yes, sure, we can discuss a little bit on nutrition, but where's the catch? What's so specific about this clinical case that I want to present it to you? I didn't tell you everything about Stella. In fact, this bitch had something specific. A few months before, the veterinarian, in fact, diagnosed a chronic condition, a pancreatitis in Stella. And because of this specific condition, part of her medical treatment, part of the therapy she was receiving was that she was fed with a therapeutic diet that helped, according to the veterinarian, to stabilize the clinical signs of the chronic pancreatitis. So this is, and that's why he called us, in fact, because there was a dilemma here. He didn't really know what he should do, because for sure, we have a bitch which suffers from a chronic condition, a medical condition that requires a therapeutic diet. But on the other side, she's pregnant. And since she's pregnant, what is he supposed to do? Is he supposed to keep feeding her with the therapeutic diet, or is he supposed to switch her over to a diet which is designed for pregnancy and growth? That will better fulfill our nutritional requirements during this very specific life stage. So that's not always an easy one to answer, because if you look at inside the textbooks of nutrition, there's not a lot of things on how to feed a pregnant bitch that at the same time suffers from a medical condition that requires a specific medical therapeutic diet. So I think to answer this question, it's important to know a few things. And the first thing, which is really important to know, and where you will be able to also give lots of advice to your clients, is how you feed a bitch during pregnancy, a normal bitch which has no medical history or no specific requirement for any medical condition. So I just wanted to show you this graph that maybe some of you already saw, but you know that in the bitch and in the queen, as a matter of fact, gestation is very short. In fact, in the bitch, we know that gestation length is 63 more or less 1 day post-ovulation. So when you know the day of ovulation, you know when the bitch basically is going to give birth. But the point, when you look at the graph here, you see that, in fact, in two months, roughly, we will move from the stage of gametes, from one spermatozoa and one egg merging together, to a full puppy that is viable. 2 months, very short time when we think about it compared to large animals. And during these 2 months, if you look at the graph here, this represents the weight gain of the bitch, we realized that, in fact, there are two different phases. In fact, the first phase, you see that here, there's not a very important weight gain during the first stage of pregnancy. And this first stage is important. It goes from the beginning of gestation to 42 days of gestation. One key thing to communicate to your clients, the fetuses, the puppies, they will gain 70% of their final body weight during the last 20 days of gestation. Why is that so important? Because again, as I said at the beginning, there are lots of misconceptions out there. The biggest one is that because the bitch is pregnant, because she's pregnant and the pregnancy length is so short, she needs more energy, more protein, more fat, more calcium, more phosphorus. She needs more everything since the very beginning of gestation. So to do that, very often our customers and even some breeders, what they will do is that they will say, okay, since they need more everything, we will free-feed the animal since the beginning of pregnancy, or we will start feeding this animal a puppy diet, a growth-specific diet, since the beginning of pregnancy, because it contains indeed more energy, more proteins, more calcium, more phosphorus, etc. And that's a big misconception, and that's a big mistake, because when you know that when you feed extra energy, extra amounts of energy in an individual that doesn't require it, this extra energy is turned into fat, and fat has a bad tendency to infiltrate the muscles. And one of the muscles which is extremely important is the uterus, the myometrium, the muscular part of the uterus. So when fat infiltrates the myometrium, automatically this will weaken the capacity of the uterus to properly contract at the time of parturition. And because it does not properly contract, then it has an impact on the pattern of uterine contractions at the time of parturition. So those graphs I'm showing you there, in fact, are from the human medicine. But in dogs, be aware that today we have the ability to monitor as well the pattern of uterine contractions. There are some veterinary clinics that do that today. And we also know that the body condition will impact this uterine contraction pattern. So you see that overweight individuals will have less frequent uterine contractions and weaker uterine contractions. So that will definitely increase the risk of dealing with what we call dystocia, difficulties to give birth at the time of parturition. And we know that dystocia directly impacts, in fact, the neonatal survival rate in those puppies. In normal parturitions, usually you deal with roughly a 10 to 15% neonatal mortality rate. In cases of dystocia, you will deal with up to 40% of neonatal mortality rate, which is definitely way higher. And you understand that this will happen if you do the mistake I mentioned before. You feed a diet which is too rich, too energy dense since the beginning of gestation. But what happens if you do the opposite? What happens if you keep the bitch under a maintenance diet and you don't do any changes? The fact is that because during the last 20 days there is an increase in energy, etc., at the time of parturition, there's a high risk that your bitch will be underweight. And underweight is associated with, you see, it looks like the contractions are stronger and more frequent, but this is a pattern of what we call a spastic contraction of the uterus. So when you have that, in fact, the uterus contracts in a totally uncoordinated way. Terrible words to say when you speak French. And because it's not well coordinated, it also increases the risk of ending up dealing with dystocias. So altogether, your target is that the bitch has a normal body weight throughout pregnancy, because if she becomes overweight during gestation or if she becomes underweight during gestation, this will definitely impact the contractions, the pattern of contractions of the uterus, and this will definitely impact the neonatal survival rate of the puppies to be born. So you understand now why it's so critical to properly feed a bitch during gestation. But let's come back to our clinical case, because, okay, we understand now that why is it so important to properly feed those animals during gestation. But in this case, we are in a very specific situation. We are in a case where the bitch requires a therapeutic diet to, in fact, help treat a medical condition. So rule of thumb, typically, we don't recommend to breed those individuals that suffer from a chronic condition. The problem is that obviously when the bitch is pregnant, you know that she's going to secrete an hormone, progesterone, which is essential to maintain pregnancy, but which will also decrease the efficiency of the immune system, and altogether the sex hormones can have an impact on an ongoing disorder. So it can exacerbate the problems related to the medical condition, and it's always very difficult to say if it's going to be the case or not. So rule of thumb, we usually don't recommend to breed those animals suffering from a medical condition because we have no way to tell how this is going to turn out. But in this specific case, it's important to keep in mind that accidents do happen, and when they happen, obviously you have to deal with them. And if you deal with this kind of unwanted pregnancy in a bitch suffering from a medical condition, I think it's always important to discuss with the client about medical abortion. Today we have very efficient protocols to induce medical abortion in the bitch. And if we think that the pregnancy is going to be a risk for the health of the animal, if we take it before 45 days of gestation, we can definitely induce a medical abortion. Before 35 days of gestation, if you induce medical abortion, there will be no external clinical signs. So the client will not know that the pregnancy stopped. They will not see any vulvar discharge, anything on the bitch. So I think it's always something important to discuss with your clients and to let them know that they have this option. And if you are interested in, I'll be more than happy to share with you the medical protocols available today to induce abortion in the bitch and the queen in Canada. But that's definitely something to discuss. And remember, in this case, this is something we could have considered because the bitch was seen 4 weeks after being bred. So she was maybe around 30 days after ovulation. So it was still very early, and we could still induce abortion medically in this animal. But this is something the veterinarian proposed to the owners, and the owners didn't want this solution. They said, no, you know what, we really want to try to keep these puppies. We understand that they are a risk, but we would like to keep them. So again, same dilemma. What do we do in terms of nutrition? Because we know she's going to need more energy, but how do we combine the fact that she requires a therapeutic diet for a medical condition and that at the same time she's pregnant? And unfortunately, I'm forced to tell you that there's no magic solution here. We have to make a compromise. And the compromise is that we know that the therapeutic diet might not be totally adapted to the requirements, to the nutritional requirements of the bitch during gestation. Remember, there are 3 main nutrients to focus on during gestation in the bitch: energy, protein, and minerals, especially calcium and phosphorus. These are the 3 essential ones to consider. When we think about that, in fact, we know that when we're going to feed the bitch during pregnancy, in this specific case, we will focus, in fact, on what the recommendations are in the textbooks. And if you look at this graph here, in this first phase of gestation, from beginning to 42 days of gestation, roughly, we know that there will be a minimal growth of the embryos. So because of that, typically at this stage, we usually recommend to keep the bitch under a maintenance diet when it's a normal gestation. We don't recommend to switch her to a more energy-dense diet during this first stage of gestation. So in the case of Stella here, we recommended to keep her under a therapeutic diet, and we didn't make any dietary modification. We just wanted her to keep her optimal body weight so that we will fulfill at least the energy requirements for this first part of gestation. But for that, we didn't make any dietary modification. And then we know again that during the last phase of gestation, there will be an increase in the energy needs because this is again when the puppies will gain most of their weight before birth. And because of that, typically when in a normal bitch, it is recommended to increase by plus 10% per week the quantities of food the animal is fed. And typically in real life, this is when we will switch to a puppy diet or a growth diet to help better sustain and better fulfill those specific needs. Here, what we recommended to do is, in fact, to stay under the therapeutic diet and to increase by plus 10% per week the amount of this therapeutic diet the bitch was fed with. Again, it's certainly not the best solution in terms of nutrition for the gestation, but it's a compromise that takes into account the fact that she requires a specific diet, and at the same time, she has increased energy needs, increased protein needs, etc., because of the developing gestation. So it's a compromise. There might be some deficiencies, but that's definitely the best we can come up with in this kind of situations. And unfortunately, it's very hard always to predict what's going to happen or it's going to turn out. So I think when we do that, it's always important at the same time to tell the clients that there are some challenges that we might have to face. Because again, we know that this is not the perfect diet for gestation, and it's just a compromised nutritional solution we can come up with. The challenges we can end up dealing with here are the fact that because we increase the quantity by plus 10% per week since day 40 of gestation, we will end up before parturition at roughly plus 40% the amount of food we were feeding the animal at the very beginning for maintenance. So for certain dogs, for large breeds, etc., it might not be a big problem. But in smaller breeds, this can be problematic because remember, the uterus is getting bigger, it compresses the stomach, and because it compresses the stomach volume is reduced, so the bitch may have some difficulties to eat this larger amount of kibbles. So one thing we can try to overcome this issue is to fraction this meal, this amount of food we need to give on a daily basis in smaller meals, 4, 5, 6 meals per day eventually, just to decrease the digestive workload and try to make sure that the bitch receives the energy she requires. But again, it's a compromise, and there's a risk that the volume of food we need to feed this animal is too large, that she will not be able to eat all of it. That's why usually we switch to a more energy-dense diet in normal conditions, because since it's more energy-dense, we can feed them smaller meals that contains more energy just because it's more energy concentrated. In this kind of situation, again, it's a compromise, and we need to know that this could be a challenge in certain bitches, and we need to make sure that eventually by giving them small meals, that they ingest all the food we are giving them on a daily basis. The other challenge we might have to deal with concerns the puppies. The nutrition we give the bitches during gestation will directly impact the parturition outcome. This is something we already discussed, but it will also impact the quality of the milk after parturition. And whether it's a problem with the parturition or with the milk production, you understand that puppies can definitely suffer from it. So it's very important to tell these owners that there's a risk that those puppies might eventually be a little bit weaker. We know today that the way we feed the bitch during pregnancy directly impacts the puppy's vitality right after birth. If the bitch was well fed during gestation, puppies will usually be more active right after birth. And if unfortunately the bitch didn't receive the nutrition she required during gestation, you might deal with weaker puppies, less active puppies. So there might be an impact that can be seen right after birth. Because those puppies rely on very few energy reserves right after birth, and this energy they have comes from the nutrition of the mother during gestation. It will also come from the quality of the milk that they will drink right after parturition. And again, we know that this can be impacted by the nutrition during gestation. So definitely important to tell the owners how to deal with those newborns which are potentially at risk. Two things I think they really need to have on hand is a thermometer and a scale. A thermometer because typically when a puppy is not doing well, the first reflex we have is to bottle feed them. And when we bottle feed them, we tend to forget that puppies are prone to hypothermia. They cannot thermoregulate. They cannot regulate their internal body temperature during the first 3 weeks of life. Right after birth, they are usually around 36 degrees Celsius. But if their temperature drops below 34 degrees Celsius, they are no more able to digest. So if you bottle feed them, while in fact they cannot properly digest the milk you're feeding them with, it will lead to a stomach bloat, and eventually they will do a forced aspiration that can have severe consequences, obviously, on their health. So first thing, before bottle feeding a puppy, always check its body temperature, and if it's too cold, you need to warm it up. And that's why I definitely think your owners, if they are in this kind of situation, they need to be geared to deal with this specific case. The scale is important because, rule of thumb, again, a healthy puppy gains weight on a daily basis. So those newborn puppies, they should gain weight regularly. They can usually lose some weight, up to 10% of their initial body weight after birth, during the first day after birth, because they would expulse the meconium, and because of that, they can lose, as I said, around 10% of their birth weight. But then they should grow, they should gain weight. If they are not, if they are doing a plateau, or if they are losing weight, there might be something going on, and we can eventually think in this specific situation that it can be related to the poor quality of the milk. So again, I think that the new owners need to monitor the body weight of those puppies, and they need to have on hand a dedicated canine milk replacer. Because if, remember, 2 bitches out of 3 will give birth in the middle of the night. So they need to have this milk replacer on hand, because we'll never know. Maybe the bitch will not produce milk. Maybe they will have those puppies that are not gaining weight, and maybe it's a weekend. So it's good to have it on hand, because you'll never know when you will need it. So tell them that. They will have to take special care of these newborns right after birth, in case, unfortunately, the nutrition was not able to fulfill properly the needs of the bitch during gestation. Because again, remember, we came up here with a compromise, a compromise in terms of nutritional solution. So now you better understand what we can do in these situations. And in fact, in this case, Stella gave birth to healthy puppies, and everything went fine. So luckily, the owners didn't have to do a lot of things on the puppies, but I think it's always good to prepare them for the worst case scenario that can happen. And now, what if Stella was a queen? This is a question I asked, in fact, to veterinary students 3 years ago when I visited the different vet schools across Canada. I asked them, how do you feed a pregnant queen? Do you feed a pregnant queen the same way you will feed a pregnant bitch? And interestingly, many students said that, yep, we will feed her the same way. And I think we often think that, you know, when we don't know for cats, we often think that cats are smaller versions of dogs, while when it comes to nutrition during gestation, it's a little bit different. Remember this graph I showed you before. This is, in fact, how the bitch increased her body weight during gestation. And that, again, explains to you why we will feed her a normal maintenance diet from the beginning to 42 days of gestation, and then we will switch to a higher energy dense diet like a puppy diet, etc., between the 40 and 60 days of gestation. But so that's what we do in the bitch. In the queen, look at the body weight gain during gestation. Totally different. In fact, those differences can be explained when we look at the strategy of those 2 species to produce milk, in fact, during lactation. In the bitch, milk production is essentially based, the way the bitch will, in fact, sustain her milk production is through food consumption. The food she will eat will provide her with all the nutrients and all the energy she requires to produce milk. In the queen, this will not be the case. The food she will eat during lactation will never be enough to sustain properly the milk production. So that's why the queen accumulates reserves during gestation to be able to properly sustain lactation after parturition. And that explains to you the difference here. In the queen, in fact, on the contrary to the bitch, we will increase the quantity of food we feed the queen by plus 10% per week since the very beginning of gestation. While remember, in the bitch, we will only do that after 40 days of gestation. So again, totally different growth pattern when it comes to gestation between the 2 species. And there's more to that. Look at the aspect of those curves. I don't know if you guys love math. I do love math. And here, when I looked at those graphs for the first time, I realized that, in fact, we can use those properties and their main aspect to kind of try to predict the weight gain and the weight a pregnant bitch or a pregnant queen should be at during the gestation. The textbook tells us that, in fact, the bitch at the time of parturition will weigh plus 115, 125% her optimal body weight right before parturition. When you know this number and you know what the curves look like, you can easily use this data. And if you know, obviously, the optimal body weight of the animal, you can use these numbers and the fact that here it's a linear pattern to determine, to create, in fact, a mathematical equation that helps you predict the body weight of the bitch at each specific point during her gestation. So you can basically know how much she should weigh on a weekly basis during her gestation. And we can do the same with the queen. And you see that in the queen, it's a little bit different. At the time of parturition, right before parturition, plus 140, 150% of optimal body weight. So if you know the optimal body weight of those individuals, you can predict what their weight gain should be throughout gestation. And that's a very good tool to monitor if they gain weight properly during gestation. That is something you can do to help your clients in case they are customers that are not used to deal with pregnant animals, etc., and they want to be reassured. So it's a very easy way to make sure the animals are on track in terms of weight gain. Again, if you like math, these are very simple equations to do. If you don't like math, don't worry. I, in fact, created Excel calculators that you can use if you know the optimal body weight. It will automatically give you the weight the queen or the bitch should be at a specific point during her gestation. So in the notes from this webinar, this is something I will share with you, and you will be able to use it in clinic if this is something you need. But I think it's a very interesting way to monitor the weight gain during gestation. When I was at the vet school in France, many clients were telling me, oh, but you know, during gestation, where there's very often we don't do many things. We don't monitor the health of the animals most of the time. We only come to the consultation if the animal is sick or if there's an emergency, if there's a problem, is there anything we can do to monitor their health, to monitor that everything is okay with the bitch and with the queen. I think this is a very simple way to do it, and that's something very easy to implement in your veterinary clinics. So we discussed a little bit about those specific cases when we have a bitch with a medical condition that requires a medical therapeutic diet and is pregnant at the same time. So as you understand, we had to make some compromise in terms of nutrition. But during normal gestation, there are key nutrients that we also need to focus on, like, for instance, folic acid. I'm sure you know that in humans, folic acid supplementation is recommended to decrease the incidence of cleft palates. And cleft palates are today the most common congenital abnormality we find in newborn puppies and kittens. So there's a study that was published recently that showed that, in fact, even if the bitch is fed with a high-quality diet and is in optimal body condition, at the before breeding, during her season, 10% of those bitches are, in fact, deficient in folic acid, certainly because of an increased need of folic acid during these reproductive cycles. So today, there are several publications on supplementation of folic acid in the bitch during gestation that tends to show that if you supplement with folic acid during gestation, you will decrease in the bitch the incidence of cleft palates in the puppies to be born. So that's something we recommend today. And since the development of cleft palate is related to the closure of the structure we call the neural tube, this neural tube closes at 35-40 days after the beginning of gestation. So typically today we recommend in breeding bitches to supplement them from the beginning of gestation to 40 days of gestation with folic acid to try to decrease the incidence of cleft palate in those breeds. One thing to keep in mind, however, remember that cleft palates are not only related to nutrition. There are other factors like genetics, like administration of teratogens during gestation that can also induce cleft palate. So those ones is it's a totally different story. But the nutritionally induced cleft palates are something we can eventually control by supplementing those puppies with those bitches and queens with folic acid during gestation. The other important nutrient that the queens can be supplemented with during gestation are EPA and DHA, those omega-3 fatty acids. We know that the queen, they have limited abilities to produce those omega-3 fatty acids during gestation. And in fact, if you supplement their diet during gestation with these omega-3 fatty acids, in fact, those omega-3 fatty acids will accumulate in the brain and the eyes of those puppies, of those kittens. And when they're born, studies showed that puppies born from mothers who were supplemented with EPA and DHA during gestation have better cognitive and visual abilities than puppies whose mothers were not supplemented during gestation. So that's also definitely something to consider when considering, in fact, the nutrition of the pregnancy or during gestation in the bitch and in the queen. And something which I think is also of interest concerns antioxidants. Gestation is one of those life stages which is associated with an increased oxidative stress, especially inside the uterus. So there are studies in the bitch showing that, in fact, there are more free radicals inside the uterus during the gestation period. And I'm not going to speak too much about free radicals, but you know that they can eventually damage the cells, they can damage the uterus epithelium if they are present. So it's, I think, definitely important to consider a diet which is supplemented in antioxidants during this period. Keep in mind that in other species, especially large animals and humans, antioxidant supplementation during gestation has been proven to bring some benefits, especially in terms of fertility. In dogs, again, it's very hard to tell because it's a polytocus species which produces large litters most of the time. But again, in order to protect the epithelium of the uterus from the damages of those free radicals, supplementing in antioxidants could definitely be something to consider during gestation as well, in the bitch and in the queen as well. So you can see that what we do in terms of nutrition during gestation can definitely impact the health of those puppies and the health of those kittens. But now let's move to another story. The picture I show you here, you see here a veterinary clinic. Well, obviously it's written in French, but I know that you guys in Canada are fully bilingual, so no problem for you guys. When I was a young veterinarian, and I was just starting my residency in France, in order to make some money, like many of other veterinarians, I was also doing on the side some emergency consultations in different veterinary clinics around Paris. And when you live in a city of 15 million inhabitants, many of whom are pet lovers, I can definitely tell you that when you are on call during the weekend, you never get bored, and you see many animals and many different clinical situations. And during one of those Sunday afternoon, this is what I saw. So the clients, I was sitting at the front desk at the vet clinic, and suddenly a couple just slammed the door open and rushed into the clinic, yelling, "My bitch is having a seizure! Please do something! I need to see the veterinarian." I'm sure this sounds familiar to you guys, but I could feel they were very anxious, and they were holding this bitch in their hands very tightly. And it took them a couple of minutes to acknowledge the fact that I was the veterinarian on call. I guess I was very young and they didn't believe that I could be the veterinarian. But anyway, so finally we moved to the consultation room. And on our way to the consultation room, they started to tell me that the bitch was showing seizures and she was not doing well since the beginning of the day. She was panting, she was restless, she had restlessness. She had tremors. When they put the bitch on the consultation table, I realized two things. First, she was pregnant. So since I was doing a residency in small animal reproduction, that was somehow perfect for me. But the second thing that hit me was that, look at the mammary glands here. They were engorged. They were full of milk. So she was already producing milk. The owners thought that the bitch was supposed to give birth in a week from now. but she was already producing milk, and that's a very important factor here. Because milk production, keep in mind that some bitches can start producing milk up to 20 days before parturition. So here she was pregnant, she hadn't delivered yet, and she was producing milk, and she was coming for consultation because basically she had seizures, according to the owners. And when I took her temperature, she was at 39.6, so a little bit hypothermic. So give it some thoughts. If you have this kind of clinical case rushing into your clinic when you're for an emergency consultation, what would be your differential diagnosis? I guess you would include epilepsy. You might include as well some kind of poisoning. But since I was a resident in small animal reproduction, the first thing I had in mind, especially when I saw the mammary glands engorge, was this: eclampsia. Could it be a case of eclampsia? So maybe this is a term you already heard from human medicine. Eclampsia in human medicine means something totally different from how we define it in large animals and small animals. In human medicine, it is related to hypertension in the woman during gestation. In small animals, eclampsia is related to hypocalcemia, in fact, an hypocalcemic state that leads to all the clinical signs I just described. Again, panting, hypothermia, tremors, convulsions, seizures, all those things can be related to an hypocalcemia in the bitch. And the picture I show you here, I'm not going to give you too much details about it. I'm sure you can read and better understand what it means, but it's just to show you that the calcium homeostasis, the regulatory mechanisms for the calcium homeostasis in the bitch and in the queen are tightly regulated. So it's very well regulated, and each time there is an increase or a decrease of the concentration of calcium in the blood, you have mechanism taking over to regulate this quantity of calcium in the blood. So that's why it was kind of uncommon. Today, seeing hypocalcemia in the bitch is not something very common, even during gestation. In healthy animals, So here, it was kind of interesting because, again, if I really wanted to have a definitive diagnosis, I would have drawn some blood from the bitch and I would have assayed the concentration of calcium to try to determine if she was hypocalcemic or not. But here, I mainly relied on the clinical sign, and this is often what we do when we deal with eclampsia. We make a clinical diagnosis, and based on this clinical diagnosis, we're going to see how the bitch responds to medical therapy. And that's because I was suspecting an hypocalcemia. Again, here I didn't assay calcium, which I should have done. But I said, okay, it might be an eclampsia. Eclampsia is related to hypocalcemia in the bitch. So because it should be an hypocalcemia, I'm going to simply do an IV perfusion of calcium in order to balance it again well, so that again, if we can restore the amount of calcium the bitch requires in our blood, then the problem should be over. And here, two things I wanted to point out here. So you see, in this case, we use a 10% calcium gluconate solution. So as this posology, we did a slow IV perfusion of it until we see an effect. Until the end of the clinical signs. So, and when you use this kind of solution, sometimes you might need to inject up to 20 milliliters before you see a clinical effect. The thing is that there are many different solutions of calcium available. You can use calcium lactate, you can use calcium propionate, you can use calcium borogluconate. The percentage of the solution might vary. So it's important to be able to compare those solutions. And in the notes I'm going to share with you after this webinar, you will have a table that will help you compare those different solutions of calcium that are available to you guys in your clinics, because it varies from country to country, even from suppliers to suppliers. So it's important for you to be able to compare them properly. And here, that's what we were using in France, because it's very easy for us to have 10% calcium gluconate. And when we did that, the amazing thing, when you deal with a case of eclampsia, a real eclampsia, when you supplement them with calcium, very quickly they're back on their feet. So the bitch here, Zaza, 30 minutes after starting the perfusion, she was back on her feet. She looks totally normal, totally healthy. It's like nothing happened while she was coming, and she wasn't able to stand up because of the seizures and the tremors, etc. So when we deal with eclampsia, usually we have a very good and very quick response to the treatment. One thing I want to mention here as well, when I did this case with, when I dealt with this case a very long time ago now, I was still a very young veterinarian. I was bold and brave. So I didn't use an ECG monitoring while I was injecting calcium gluconate IV. I think today, if I had to do it again, I would definitely use an ECG monitoring just to make sure that while I inject calcium, it doesn't cause any arrhythmia in the bitch, because that's, is a side effect we can end up dealing with. And if we see any signs of arrhythmia, we know that we need to stop supplementing with calcium. So again, keep this in mind. But typically, this kind of therapy is very effective. And when the bitch was feeling better, we could have said, okay, now she feels better, we can send her back home. But that's not what we did here. And we said, okay, we need to make sure she's properly stabilized because, again, if she's leaving and she starts to have seizures again, we don't want you to come back maybe in the middle of the night. Some cases of eclampsia can be life-threatening depending on the intensity and the severity of the clinical signs. So again, we said what we did here, we kept the bitch hospitalized for 24 hours, and we were injecting a solution of calcium gluconate subcutaneously every 8 hours. Typically, we were injecting at this posology, 0.3 ml per kilo in small dogs, 0.5 ml per kilo in large dogs, in order, again, to provide her with enough calcium and to make sure that she was stabilized before she goes back home, because we didn't want the owners to come back in the middle of the night saying, oh, she started having a crisis again. So again, this is how we approach it. This is how we approach the emergencies. This is how we dealt with the emergency. There's one thing which might have surprised you here. Eclampsia, again, is not that common today in the beach. But however, what is very weird here is that usually when you see a case of eclampsia, it usually occurs during lactation, typically 3 weeks post-parturition, because this is when the bitch is at her peak of lactation. And because she's at her peak of lactation, she exports massive amounts of calcium. And this is how she can become hypocalcemic, because she's exporting so much calcium in the milk that she becomes hypocalcemic, and she develops eclampsia, and she comes in for an emergency consultation. But here it's not the case. Here she's still pregnant. And however, she started lactation. So you see, when you suspect a case of eclampsia, always look at the mammary gland. Remember, it can happen during gestation if the bitch is already lactating. And it can even happen sometimes because of the ossification of the puppies during the late gestation. Again, because of the massive export of calcium required for the ossification of the bones of those puppies. So keep in mind that it is mainly something you will deal with during lactation, but it can also happen at the end of parturition. If in case it happens during lactation, one thing to keep in mind, the problem is that if the puppies are still nursing, you will not be able to properly control the amount of calcium that is exported to the milk, and it will be very difficult to stabilize the animal, because as soon as the puppies will start nursing again, you might end up seeing again the crisis of eclampsia. So typically when you deal with a lactating bitch with an eclampsia, first you need to treat the emergency, but for the puppies you need to remove them from the mammary gland, bottle feed them. If it's around 3 weeks of age, you can start thinking of weaning them very early. We can start weaning puppies at 3 weeks and a half. This is the earliest we can start. But in this kind of scenario, we can imagine starting weaning them very early. And if we do that, we definitely need to stop the lactation in the bitch, because if you stop the lactation, it will be way easier for you to control the export of calcium and the problem related to hypocalcemia in this animal. Again, today we have very efficient protocols to stop the lactation in lactating bitches. It's mainly based on the use of an antiprolactinic called cabergoline that is available in Canada. And if this is something you guys are interested in, feel free to email me and I'll be more than happy to share this protocol with you. But in those cases, it will be important to stop the lactation in the bitch. So when everything was stabilized with Zaza, etc., I had a chat with the owners because I was wondering, again, quite an unusual case to see eclampsia in a pregnant bitch these days. Because hypocalcemia, especially during gestation, the mechanisms of that regulate calcium homeostasis are pretty tight. So it's very difficult to. I was wondering, this could happen. And during the discussion, in fact, they told me this bitch was fed with a homemade diet, and she was fed with a meat-based diet, essentially, which we know is highly deficient in calcium. So because of an inappropriate nutrition during gestation, because they thought that was the best thing to feed their bitch with, again, this leads to this case of hypocalcemia. Another thing which is interesting here, hypocalcemia can happen in any bitch, but apparently it is more frequent in small size and medium sized breeds. And in my experience, and again, I don't know why, but all the cases of eclampsia as I saw were on small white bitches. I don't know why that, but this, remember that small breeds are definitely predisposed to end up dealing with eclampsia. Something else, sometimes we say that small breeds with large litters might be more predisposed because they need to export more calcium for the ossification of those puppies and for the milk production to feed this litter. But many authors, in fact, there are different opinions, and some authors said that litter size has no effect on the risk of eclampsia. So small size and medium sized breeds, bitches, yes, but litter size might not really be a predisposing factor to development of eclampsia. Interestingly as well, in the cow, we know that in fact they have more chances to develop hypocalcemia as the cow ages. Because in fact the vitamin D receptors tend to disappear. They have less vitamin D receptors, so they are more prone to have difficulties to regulate calcium homeostasis. In the bitch, most of the cases we see are in primiparous bitches, which is totally the opposite, in fact. And the the reason behind might be the fact that, in fact, primiparous bitches, since they're bred for the first time and the owners experience this very stressful situation, they decide usually after that not to breed the bitch again. But keep in mind that age might also have an impact on the occurrence of eclampsia in the bitch. So here, basically what we did with Zaza, when she was stabilized, we sent her back home with a diet for this specific stage of pregnancy, basically a puppy diet. And she gave birth totally normally 1 week after without any issues. So, and she didn't do any other crisis of eclampsia after that, after she was switched over to a normal, well-balanced diet. So I think that's definitely something important to discuss with your clients. During gestation, they need to receive a balanced diet because if it is not the case, as you can see, there can definitely have severe consequences. And there's also something important to keep in mind. This is another myth you will find on internet. Very often it is said that pregnant bitches should be supplemented with calcium during gestation, even if they are fed with a supposed balanced diet during gestation. In fact, today we know that when you respect the feeding guidelines for the bitch, again, maintenance diet from beginning to 42 days of gestation, and then a puppy diet, which obviously contains more calcium, etc., during the last 20 days of gestation, you don't need to supplement with calcium again, because if you supplement with calcium again, excessive supplementation of calcium during gestation is associated with higher risk of hypocalcemia in those bitches. In the past, we thought that maybe because you were feeding them a very high amount of calcium, it was basically shutting down the mechanism, the homeostasis mechanisms of the bitch, and she was not able to properly respond to a high or low concentration of calcium. And when she required to export a massive amount of calcium for lactation or for ossification of the puppy, she couldn't respond properly, and then she was developing hypocalcemia and eclampsia. In fact, today there's another hypothesis on the mechanism, and it could also be related, in fact, to what we call a cationic anionic disbalance, because the bitch is supplemented with excessive amount of calcium, you have a cationic disbalance, so more cations that are fed in to the bitch, and because of that, this will impact the acid-base status of the animal, and this modification of the acid-base status will impact the calcemia, the calcium concentration in the blood of the animal. So excessive calcium concentration is definitely not recommended during the pregnant bitch if she's fed an appropriate diet, again, as we mentioned before. And that's important because, again, that's a very, very common myth we see in the field. And recently, I had 2 cases where, in fact, those bitches developed an eclampsia while they were fed with a properly balanced diet. And this was something that apparently happened each time they were pregnant and each time they were delivering. So there might be some bitches which are predisposed to develop eclampsia despite the fact that they are fed with a well-balanced diet. So only in those exceptions, and again, those cases are really rare, but if you have a bitch with an history of eclampsia, despite the fact she was fed with a well-balanced diet throughout gestation and during lactation, in only those cases, you can eventually consider supplementing them with calcium, especially during lactation, or we can even start at the very end of gestation. But these are the only exceptions, and I showed you the posologies we were using for those cases, 0.3 milliliter per kilo of a 10% calcium gluconate solution, or 0.5 milliliter per kilo for larger bitches, but these are the only exceptions when it comes to preventing hypocalcemia in predisposed bitches. And one last case of emergency that can come up to the clinic and that can be related to nutrition during gestation. Vega, she was a 2-year-old Cane Corso. She was belonging to our former assistant. And again, she was pregnant at the end of her gestation, and she came for consultation because the owner thought that she wasn't feeling well. She was lethargic. She was not as active as usual, so she came because she was pregnant and she wanted to make sure that everything was okay for the puppies. So when we saw the bitch in consultation, again, it was an emergency consultation, and that was at the very beginning of my veterinary career. So I thought, well, you know, lethargy, end of gestation, she was lactating as well. Maybe it's another form of eclampsia because maybe it's a different clinical expression. You know that unfortunately in biology everything is possible. So I said, okay, let's try to do the same thing we did in the previous case. So I adopted the exact same approach. I supplemented her with calcium, etc. But you know what? After 2 hours, there was no medical improvement at all. While remember, in the case with Zaza, 30 minutes after calcium supplementation, she was back on her feet. Here, 2 hours after, not a single sign of improvement. So I was thinking, oh, I might have missed something, and I definitely missed something here. So I went to do a blood work on this bitch. And one thing I assessed was the blood glucose concentration. And when the result came back, she was at 0.6 gram per liter. So when I saw that, it hit me, and I said, wow, okay, I missed something, because typically when you deal with hypocalcemia, in the past we said that there was an association with hypoglycemia, but today we know that this is not really the case. But this bitch was hypoglycemic. And one thing I definitely recommend you to do if you deal with those cases, always assess the blood calcium concentration and the blood glucose concentration so that you can discriminate between the 2 conditions, because here, in fact, I was doing with what we call a pregnancy toxemia. Pregnancy ketosis is also a name we will see from time to time. And this can definitely explain the symptoms we observe here. The bitch is lethargic, she's hypoglycemic. If I had done a urine analysis, I would have found that there were ketonic bodies in the urine without glucosuria, which is very pathognomonic to the pregnancy ketosis, especially when it is associated with a blood hypoglycemia. This typically happens when the bitch doesn't receive proper nutrition during gestation, and typically this happens when the bitch stop eating during the last 2 weeks of gestation, because she doesn't receive enough carbohydrates to produce energy from her diet. So since she doesn't receive enough carbohydrates, the body starts to use the fatty acids to produce energy. And when they use fatty acids to produce energy, basically acetone and beta-hydroxybutyrate, which are ketonic bodies, will accumulate in the blood, leading to this hypoglycemia and the pregnancy toxemia signs that we just described. And another clinical sign that is described, we typically say that those bitches, their breath smells like apple. So unfortunately, I'm anosmic, so I couldn't smell that. But this is definitely something you can look into as well. Here, we were dealing with a case of pregnancy toxemia. And when I spoke with the owner, she told me, oh, indeed, the bitch wasn't eating for more than 5 days. So something very basic to tell your customers and the owners of a pregnant bitch, when during gestation, they need to make sure that the bitch eats properly and eats all the food throughout gestation. I had few cases recently where, in fact, the owners were dealing with high levels of neonatal mortality, difficulties to give birth in the bitch, and they didn't understand why. And during the discussion, they told us, oh, but you know, these bitches stop eating 1 week before parturition. When they stop eating 1 week before parturition, they are a high risk of developing pregnancy toxemia. And today we know that pregnancy toxemia might have an impact on the occurrence of dystocias. It is still a little bit controversial. Some authors say it increases the risk of dystocia. Some other authors say it does not. But what we are all sure about is that when you deal with pregnancy toxemia, because of the hypoglycemia that is induced, those newborn puppies, they're weaker. And because they're weaker, they typically have a higher neonatal mortality rate and a higher rate of stillbirths. So we definitely need to counteract the effect of the hypoglycemia if we want to help those puppies, and again, to improve their chances of survival. So basically in those cases, we will just give an IV perfusion of 5% dextrose solution. And in the case of Vega here, 2 hours after, she recovered well and she was feeling way better. But we know that even if the bitch feels way better, the prognosis is always reserved for the puppies to be born. And pregnancy toxemia is mainly caused because you have the gestation going on, and the progesterone clearly influences the development of the pregnancy toxemia. So for sure, your clients need to make sure that the bitch eats on a daily basis. And if she goes off her food for 1-2 days, there's an issue. There's definitely important to take actions to avoid pregnancy toxemia to develop. But when it has developed, you know that you can stabilize the bitch, but then it will become very difficult to help the puppies because they will suffer from this hypoglycemia state. So one way to relieve the problem is to perform a C-section, to schedule a C-section as quickly as possible. So in the case of Vega, we were very close to the parturition date, so we could definitely schedule an elective C-section in order to deal with this and to deal with the hypoglycemia and the fact that the gestation was causing the pregnancy toxemia. But when this happens earlier during gestation, it's very rare, but everything's possible in biology. If you are before 58 days of gestation, unfortunately, those puppies are not mature enough so that you can do a C-section and remove them from the uterus of the mother. So in certain cases, again, if it happens before 58 days post-ovulation during gestation, you might have to consider a medical abortion in order to prevent the consequences of this hypoglycemia in the bitch, especially if she's in very poor condition. So again, not something frequent today if the bitch is properly fed during gestation, and if you make sure she eats on a daily basis. But that's something key to tell your clients. If the bitch goes off her food for more than 24 hours, some actions need to be taken, and it's good that they consult with you to see what can be done to avoid dealing with a pregnancy toxemia case. So that's what I wanted to tell you tonight on the role of nutrition on gestation in the bitch. Again, I think in veterinary clinics today, as I said before, we are always trying to differentiate our activities, etc. And I think here there are huge possibilities in canine reproduction. remember, we have a big role to play in educating our customers, our breeders, on how they could use nutrition to optimize the reproductive performances of their animals, or just to help those animals and those puppies to be more healthy and to decrease the risk of neonatal mortality in those puppies. So there are big misconceptions out there. Even if we are in 2015, many people still believe that you need to feed the bitches with puppy diet since the beginning of pregnancy. We need to supplement those bitches with calcium throughout gestation. Those are very big mistakes that can have severe consequences, as you could see in the few cases I just showed you. And again, I think in our vet clinics, we clearly have a very big role to play in order to help those breeders, help those customers, so that the newborn puppies are born as healthy as possible. And that's always a good start in life when this is the case. So thank you very much for listening to me for a little bit more than 1 hour, I think. It's always a pleasure to have those webinars with you guys. So I'm just going to stop the recording of the webinar, and I'm going to move back to the chat. So if you have any questions, please post them on the chat, and I will answer them on the phone so that you can hear the answers. So thank you again, and have a great evening. Bye-bye.